May 14th, 1967. Small's Paradise. Harlem's lights were low, the music soft, the kind of night where nothing was supposed to go wrong. Frank Lucas sat down across the table, trying to steady his hands. He had faced guns before. He had faced police, rivals, and men who wanted him dead. But he had never been afraid like this, because the man sitting across from him wasn't an enemy. It was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse, he didn't threaten, he didn't even look angry. He simply slid an envelope across the table and waited. No hurry, no drama. The calm of a man who already knows the truth. When Frank opened it, 3 photographs fell out. Saigon, a handshake, a briefcase, coffins being loaded onto a plane. Frank understood immediately. This wasn't suspicion. This was proof. That moment wasn't the end of a business relationship. It was the end of a belief. For 6 years, Frank Lucas had lived under Bumpy Johnson's shadow, learning not just how to make money, but how to live with rules. Harlem had a code. You could hustle, you could gamble, you could run numbers, but you did not sell poison, not to your own people. That line wasn't flexible, it wasn't symbolic, it was absolute. And now Frank had crossed it. What made this moment different wasn't that Frank got caught. It was that Bumpy had already known, for months. And instead of stopping him immediately, Bumpy had watched. He had waited. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson isn't punishment. It's letting someone reveal who they really are. Frank thought this night was about survival, about whether he could talk his way out, lie his way through, or negotiate his way back into safety. He was wrong. This night was about something far more final. It was about exile, about losing not just protection, but identity. Because when Bumpy Johnson took his hand off Frank Lucas's shoulder, Frank didn't just lose a mentor. He lost the only thing that had ever kept him from becoming exactly what he would one day regret. This is the story of how a man betrayed his teacher for millions and spent the rest of his life understanding the cost. When Frank Lucas arrived in Harlem in the early 1960s, he wasn't special. He wasn't rich. He wasn't feared. He was just another ambitious man from North Carolina with sharp eyes and a quiet mouth. And that last part mattered. Harlem was full of loud talkers who burned bright and disappeared fast. Frank watched instead. He listened. And that's why Bumpy Johnson noticed him. Bumpy didn't choose men based on bravado or cruelty. He chose men who understood restraint. Frank drove him to meetings, waited outside restaurants, carried envelopes without asking questions. He never bragged, never rushed, never stepped out of line. Over time, Bumpy stopped correcting him. Then he started explaining things, not orders, reasons. Why you never raise your voice in a negotiation. Why you let silence do the work. Why power that needs to announce itself isn't power at all. Frank became more than a runner. He became a student. By 1963, when Bumpy returned from Alcatraz and found Harlem fractured by opportunists and traitors, Frank was already standing at his side, not speaking, watching, learning how a man reclaims authority without firing a shot. Frank saw Bumpy restore order not with terror, but with memory. Who owed what? Who had been loyal? Who had crossed lines and how long ago? Harlem wasn't ruled like territory. It was ruled like a ledger. And then there was the code. Bumpy made it clear early. Numbers were allowed. Gambling was allowed. Hustling was allowed. Those things gave poor people hope, distraction, a chance to breathe. But drugs, hard drugs, were forbidden. Heroin wasn't business. It was corrosion. It ate families from the inside, hollowed out neighborhoods, turned sons into ghosts and mothers into beggars. Anyone who touched it wasn't just a criminal, they were an enemy. Frank didn't just accept that rule, he believed in it. For years, he enforced it himself. When small-time pushers tested the edges of Harlem, Frank shut them down. Not violently, efficiently. He took pride in being part of something that wasn't just profitable, but principled. Under Bumpy, Frank wasn't just making money, he was becoming someone. That's why Bumpy trusted him. Not because Frank was loyal by nature, but because he seemed to understand the difference between ambition and hunger, between building something and consuming it. In Bumpy's eyes, Frank wasn't just useful. He was the future. The man who could inherit Harlem without destroying it. And that's what made the betrayal unbearable. Because when Frank later told himself he could bend the rules just a little, sell poison somewhere else, keep Harlem clean, he wasn't just lying to Bumpy. He was lying to the man Bumpy believed he was. By 1966, Frank Lucas had done everything right, at least on paper. He had respect, he had protection, he had position. Under Bumpy Johnson, he was earning well, living comfortably, and carrying real authority in Harlem. But comfort has a way of sharpening desire instead of dulling it. Frank began noticing what other men were making. Not quietly noticing, counting. The Italians were pulling in millions from heroin, not tens of thousands, millions. French connection routes were exploding. Southeast Asia was opening pipelines no one in Harlem had access to. Every month, Frank watched men he considered inferior buy bigger houses, wear louder suits, and command fear with money alone. And for the first time, the lessons Bumpy taught him began to feel slow. The idea didn't arrive as betrayal. It arrived as logic. Frank told himself a story he wanted to believe. He wouldn't sell heroin in Harlem, never there. He would keep the neighborhood clean. The poison would move through Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, places already lost, already corrupted. In his mind, that distinction mattered. It allowed him to believe he was still loyal, still principled, still the man Bumpy had trained. This is how people betray codes without admitting it. They redraw the borders. When Frank met Leslie Ike Atkinson, a U.S. Army sergeant with access to Southeast Asian supply lines, the temptation stopped being theoretical. This wasn't street heroin. This was pure product. Direct source. Coffin shipments coming back from Vietnam. Untouchable, invisible, unthinkable. The kind of operation that didn't just make money but rewrote hierarchies. Frank hesitated. Long enough to tell himself he was being careful. Long enough to pretend he was still choosing. But when he said, "Let me think about it," the decision was already made. The first shipment was small. A test. 2 kilos. It sold instantly. $80,000 in weeks. No violence. No complications. No blowback. Frank felt something dangerous settle in his chest. Not fear, not guilt, but confirmation. The lie was working. He was getting rich and nothing was breaking. So he expanded. More trips, more weight, more distance from the man he used to be. Each step made the next one easier. The lie hardened into routine. I'm still respecting the code. I'm just smarter than everyone else. Frank stopped seeing the faces attached to the product. The addicts weren't Harlem's problem anymore. They were abstractions. Numbers, routes, margins. What Frank didn't understand was that the code wasn't geographic. It was moral. The moment he touched the poison, the line was crossed everywhere. And while Frank congratulated himself for keeping Harlem clean, Bumpy was watching something else entirely. He wasn't counting shipments. He was watching character. He was watching a student convince himself that rules only mattered when they were inconvenient. That's the most dangerous lie a man can tell himself. Because once you believe you can break a principle without consequences, you stop fearing the fall. And by the time Frank realized the ground was gone beneath his feet, the lesson was already waiting for him, quietly, patiently, back at Small's Paradise. What Frank Lucas never understood was that his operation didn't need to be loud to be visible. Harlem didn't run on secrets, it ran on memory, on people who noticed patterns, absences, changes in behavior. And Bumpy Johnson had built his power on knowing who saw what and when. The first confirmation didn't come from a rival or a wiretap. It came from a man no one ever looked at twice, a baggage handler at JFK, a quiet observer, someone who understood that coffins weren't supposed to move the way Frank's were moving. The route was clever, the timing was careful, but the confidence was the giveaway. Frank moved like someone who believed he was untouchable. When the report reached Bumpy, he didn't react the way most men would. There was no outburst, no orders, no immediate reckoning. He didn't even confront Frank. He paid the informant, closed the door, and sat alone for hours, because the truth hurt more than the betrayal. Bumpy had seen men sell out before. He'd watched partners choose money over people, power over responsibility. That wasn't new. What cut deeper was who this was coming from. This wasn't a rival. This wasn't an opportunist. This was the man Bumpy had invested years into shaping. The man he believed could inherit Harlem without destroying it. And so Bumpy did something counterintuitive. He waited, not because he was unsure, because he wanted to be certain. He wanted to see if Frank would stop himself, if the lessons had taken root deeply enough to override temptation. Bumpy believed that real loyalty didn't need supervision. It revealed itself under pressure. Month after month, the shipments grew. The weight increased. The confidence hardened. And with every step Frank took forward, Bumpy felt himself pulling back. Not in anger, in recognition, the kind that comes when hope quietly gives up. Bumpy could have ended it instantly. A phone call to the police, a word to the Italians. Frank's empire would have collapsed before it ever became public, but that would have turned Frank into a victim, and Bumpy didn't want that. He wanted Frank to face himself. So he gathered proof. Photographs, names, dates, routes. He let Frank believe he was invisible because that belief was part of the lesson. Power, Bumpy understood, isn't just about stopping someone. It's about letting them understand exactly why they fell. By the time Bumpy invited Frank to Small's Paradise, the decision had already been made. Not to punish, to sever. Frank thought that meeting would determine his future. He didn't realize it was already over. Bumpy wasn't calling him in to negotiate or warn him again. He was calling him in to acknowledge a truth both men already knew. The trust was gone. And once trust disappears, no amount of money, loyalty, or regret can buy it back. The meeting at Small's Paradise wasn't a confrontation. It was a verdict. When Frank Lucas walked into the booth that night, he still believed there was room to maneuver. He had survived pressure before. He had talked his way out of trouble. He assumed this was another moment where intelligence and confidence could smooth things over. What he didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson had already moved past anger, past disappointment, into something far colder. Clarity. Bumpy didn't accuse him, didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He let the evidence speak. Photographs laid out like a timeline of choices Frank had made step by step, lie by lie. Bangkok, Saigon, coffins, warehouses. Every image stripped away the illusion that this was a misunderstanding or a small side operation. It was a system, a commitment, a decision. Frank tried to justify it the only way he could. He said the poison never touched Harlem. He said the neighborhood was protected. He said the code still mattered. That was the moment Bumpy finally looked at him. Not as a student, not as a successor, but as a stranger, because the code was never about geography. It was about responsibility. Bumpy made that clear without drama, selling destruction anywhere to people who looked like you, who came from the same streets, was the same betrayal. Frank hadn't found a loophole. He'd found an excuse. And excuses were something Bumpy had never tolerated. The sentence was simple. Shut it all down. Walk away, disappear from Harlem. Not as punishment, but as containment. This wasn't revenge. This was quarantine. Frank had become something dangerous. Not just to the neighborhood, but to the idea Bumpy had spent decades defending. What made the moment unbearable wasn't the exile. It was the explanation. Bumpy told him the truth Frank wasn't ready to hear. The reason he hadn't stopped him earlier wasn't strategy. It was hope. Hope that the man he taught would stop himself. That the lessons mattered. That loyalty would outweigh profit. Admitting that hope had been misplaced hurt more than any betrayal ever could. That was the final lesson. Not about power, not about money, about consequence. Frank left that booth alive, untouched, free to walk away. But he didn't leave whole. He left knowing he had disappointed the one man whose respect actually mattered. And no empire he would ever build could erase the sound of Bumpy's voice telling him goodbye. Not in anger, but in finality. Because when a man like Bumpy Johnson closes the door on you, it isn't slammed. It's sealed. Frank Lucas left Harlem believing he had lost a place, not a future. He told himself exile was temporary, that respect could be rebuilt somewhere else, that money would eventually drown out memory. And for a while, it seemed like he was right. After Bumpy Johnson's death, the final barrier disappeared. The code died with the man who enforced it. Frank didn't return as a student or a son. He returned as a conqueror. He scaled the very operation Bumpy had warned him about, built an empire on purity, volume, and reach. Coffin routes, military connections, distribution networks that stretched across boroughs and states. The money came fast, obscene in scale, and for the first time in his life Frank felt untouchable. But something was missing. Power came easily. Fear followed, respect didn't. Frank ruled through money and intimidation, not memory and obligation. His name carried weight, but it didn't carry loyalty. People worked for him because they were paid, not because they believed. And when the pressure came, as it always does, those foundations collapsed overnight. No one stood in front of him. No neighborhood closed ranks. No one absorbed blows meant for him. When the arrests came, they were swift and final. The empire vanished the way it had been built, fast, mechanical, without sentiment. And suddenly, Frank had time. Too much time, 15 years of it. Prison stripped everything down to essentials. No cars, no suits, no money moving in the background, just memory. And in that quiet, one voice kept returning. The calm, disappointed voice that had warned him years earlier. Not threatening, not angry, certain. Frank finally understood what he had mistaken for weakness. Bumpy hadn't rejected money because he didn't want it. He rejected it because it cost too much. Because once you profit from destroying your own people, you're no longer building power. You're burning your future for cash. Frank had proven Bumpy right in the most complete way possible. By the time Frank was released, older and quieter, Harlem wasn't calling him back. Not because it feared him, because it no longer knew him. He had become a story people told about what happens when ambition outruns principle. And that was the real punishment. Frank didn't lose his freedom first. He lost his place. He lost the chance to be more than rich, more than feared. He lost the chance to inherit something that lasted. Bumpy Johnson left behind no empire measured in money. He left behind a standard. And Frank Lucas spent the rest of his life understanding, too late, that breaking that standard didn't make him greater. It made him replaceable. Frank Lucas walked away with millions. Bumpy Johnson walked away with something rarer, legacy. Bumpy never believed power was about how much you could take. He believed it was about how much you refused to sell. Harlem followed him not because he was the strongest man in the room, but because he was the last man who put the neighborhood ahead of himself. That kind of authority doesn't disappear when a man dies. It lingers. Frank learned the lesson in reverse. He had the empire, he had the fear, he had the headlines. And yet, when it was over, none of it stood between him and a prison cell. No community protected him. No one spoke for him. Because power built without principle collapses the moment the system turns. That's why this story isn't really about betrayal or crime. It's about the difference between influence and dominance, between ruling something and belonging to it. Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem because he belonged to it. Frank Lucas tried to rule without belonging and paid for it with 15 years of his life and the rest of it in regret. History remembers both men, but it remembers them differently. One as a king who protected his people, the other as a warning about what happens when ambition outruns loyalty. And that's the lesson Bumpy Johnson left behind, one that outlived both their empires.